Good afternoon. My name is Dave Norton from Discovering New England History. We're going to continue on with episode 5 of The Road to Andersonville, which is the historic Civil War prison that all the Union soldiers, many of them were sent down in Georgia. So we'll go to the next slide. Now, Dorrance Atwater, he's the one that copied all the secret list, made a duplicate copy of everyone that died at Andersonville. And he hid it in his coat at night. And that's an incredible thing that he did. He was only a young fella. He lied about his age. He was 16 when he went into the Civil War. So he was only probably 17 or 18 when he was at Andersonville. And they had him as a clerk because he had great penmanship, and he could actually write down all the names of the soldiers that were buried one at a time like that, their number and all the information that they had. And he did that. He was one of the first soldiers to actually get captured and go to Andersonville. So he survived the entire time there. We'll go to the next slide. Now, the war was over. We covered that in the last episode. And he made his way back to his hometown in Terryville, Connecticut. And I got that picture. The house is still there. That's his house, Terryville, Connecticut. And he brought the list with him, which he hid. He hid it because he knew the federal government wanted that list so they could actually destroy it. The whole idea was that the Union didn't, the war was over. They wanted to heal all the wounds of the war, and they didn't want to upset everybody by publishing a list in a newspaper of the over 12,000 that actually died at Andersonville. And so they wanted his list. They found out he had a list and they wanted it. It's called, we call that the Atwater hidden list. And then he received a telegram from the War Department down in Washington, D.C. shortly after he came home. Bring your list, come down to Washington, D.C. immediately. Okay, so he got on a train, headed down. And at that same time, that's the day when Lincoln was shot. And he arrived in Washington, D.C., and the whole place was in chaos or whatever. And as soon as he got there, he got another telegram from up north that his father had just died. So instead of reporting to the War Department, he took the other train back north to Terryville, Connecticut for his father's funeral. And he also had that list with him. He just holding on to that because he knew what was going to happen. If that list disappeared, all those soldiers, the families would never know their fate at all. So we'll go to the next slide. Then he got sick with all kinds of illnesses that he picked up at Andersonville. Then he recovered and he went back down to Washington, D.C. And he met Clara Barton. And she's also from New England, North Oxford, Massachusetts. She's from Connecticut. And she established a missing soldiers office. Her whole mission was to find out all the soldiers that were in the Civil War, what actually happened to them, so they can have closure to their families. We'll go to the next slide. And that's her office, which is still there today, Missing Soldiers Office. And they started talking, and Dorrance found out that, she found out that Dorrance had this list, and she was just absolutely amazed. That would really help her. So she told him she had the means to mark all the graves, but she didn't have the list. And he says, well, I happen to have the list. So they had quite a friendship here. We'll go to the next slide. Now, what they wanted to do, and Clara Barton now was on his side. Of course, she was very famous. They approached a lot of the authorities with the idea that I have the list, I want to put it in a paper. And Edwin Stanton finally, there was a lot of give and take on this. He finally said, okay, look, we'll take Clara Barton and you, Dorrance, you can go on a expedition down to Andersonville with your list and mark all the grave sites. I think that's a worthwhile thing to do. And so he did. He said, we're going to give you a 40-man detachment, Union detachment of soldiers to go with you to help you in all of that. But he kept his original list there. We'll go to the next slide. So they had a steamer boat in Washington, D.C., and they supplied them with, really half of the headboards that they really needed. There were 12,000 buried there, but they gave them 7,000 headboards made up. They were not lettered, not painted or anything, just the wood boards. And the idea was they loaded them on a ship with this 40-man detachment, and they set sail, if you will, down towards Savannah, Georgia. It took them 4 days, from July 8th to 12th, 1865, to get there. We'll go to the next slide. Now, when they got there, you got to remember there's 40 people are going to help. They were in all their equipment. They had all the lettering equipment, whatever. They're going to paint on the letter and all the information. And they got stuck here in Savannah. Word got to Savannah that the route they were going to take, which is the train track, was all ripped up. And that happened when General Sherman marched to the sea from Atlanta to Savannah. So they got stuck there for 1 week. They offloaded that ship. Can you imagine 7,000 boards they had to offload? And the commander of the detachment was a gentleman by the name of Captain James Moore. And he was in charge of the men that did that, but he absolutely did not care at all for Clara Barton. Clara Barton was assigned to kind of oversee it, and he was assigned to the detachment of soldiers. And he did everything he could to impede her and to show that he was in command and he wasn't going to take any orders or listen to any female at this time, because he was a soldier. So what happened was they found out the railroad track was done. And so they wired Washington, and he was pushing to send the expedition back. And this way, Clara Barton, he would, completely cancel her mission. She wouldn't get any of the glory of this, and that's what he wanted to do. Look, the railroad is out. We're going to send, we want official recognition from Washington to cancel this whole thing. We just can't do it. And they couldn't find enough wagons down there. They said, 7,000 of these, we don't have enough enough horses and wagons to load those on and pull those over to Andersonville. So they were really stuck here. Finally, Clara Barton found out the situation. She said, there is another way, and we've came this far. We will not stop. So they had a big fight about that, her and Captain Moore. So we'll go to the next slide. And this track, the reason it was knocked out is because when Sherman marched to the sea, he ripped all the railroad tracks down behind him. And this was soon after the war, so they really hadn't all been repaired. We'll go to the next slide. Now, I made a map here so you can see where we are. You can see over there on the right, I circled Savannah, and then I circled that route. In green is the route they were supposed to take. They're supposed to take the railroad, load the boards on the railroad, take them down the green railroad track all the way to Macon, change trains, then go south to Andersonville. Pretty direct. The whole green railroad that we saw was completely ripped up. So there's no way they could do that. Now, Clara is very resourceful and very persistent. So on her own, she came up with the idea, look, we can take a steamer up the river from Savannah to Augusta. Then we can take the train from Augusta to Atlanta and then go south to Macon and down to Andersonville. And Captain Moore didn't want to do anything with this. But they went to Washington, and Washington approved the plan. But now the journey now is 460 miles, way out of their way. We'll go to the next slide. So here we are again. They unloaded all the headboards from the first ship that came down from Washington, D.C. And now they put them on another boat. You can see it right there. And they were going to go up the Savannah River to Augusta. It took them 2 days to do that. But they proceeded, and it's interesting, from what I researched, Captain Moore did everything to discourage this mission. He got to the captain of this riverboat and said, "Look, we're going to set sail we're going to leave the dock at 7 o'clock in the morning. We're going to tell Clara that it's going to leave at 8 o'clock, and if she's not here, we're going to go off without her." That's the idea that was concocted by Captain Moore. Of course, Sarah got wind of it and made the ship. So we'll go to the next slide. So they finally got all the way up the river to Augusta, Georgia, and they stopped at the Augusta house to rest over. And that's the actual picture of the Augusta house. I researched all these pictures to give you an idea what a trip this was. We'll go to the next slide. And here's actually the railroad station. This is what it looked like in Augusta. Once again, they had to unload this riverboat with 7,000 wooden headboards and then take them over to the railroad depot and load them on to boxcars in the train. So you can imagine, this is quite an ordeal. And there's the actual train depot. Go to the next slide. And I found this drawing. I thought this was really terrific. This is actually the drawing of, the original headboards were made out of wood, and then quite a few years later, they replaced those with marble headboards. And this was the drawing of the marble headboards. But it gave me an idea of the dimensions of the wooden boards. You can see I circled the length and width of the, just to get an idea. So we're talking each headboard approximately 3.5 feet tall, 1 foot wide, and 2 inches thick. From the drawings we had at Andersonville, you could see they're a lot thinner than the actual marble ones. Go to the next slide. Then I actually found the drawing of Civil War boxcars. I wanted to get the idea of the square footage, and if they loaded all these in boxcars, there's no information on how many boxcars it would have had loaded. So I did you can see I got the length and the width and the size of the door and everything else, and I figured some space between these, and so basically, just roughly, I figured they got 1,500 headboards per boxcar with marking supplies. So roughly 6 boxcars had to be loaded. So now they took them all off the steamer and they loaded them onto boxcars. We'll go to the next slide. So now here's the train at the station, and they had to go on the train track from Augusta to Atlanta. And they figured, okay, this is going to be an easy ride, we're all set. And we'll go to the next slide. So now I got my drawing here on the right. You can see the circle where I circled Augusta, and their destination is Atlanta. Looked like a simple train ride. Well, it wasn't. They only averaged about 12 miles per hour. A lot of the rail was still in bad shape, and it had frequent stops. They had to repair tracks, start the engine up, go again. It was more of a problem than they thought. And we'll go to the next slide. This is a great shot of the train heading north towards Atlanta. And you can see the territory it went through. A lot of the bridges were washed out, everything. Train from Augusta to Atlanta. It made frequent stops. Now, the engineer, they found out, was a former Confederate officer. And he did everything he could to make this train go as slow as it can and make the repairs last longer than they should. He was very sly in doing this, but that's what he was doing. He wasn't interested in having the Union Yankees do this project either. So she's fighting the Confederate engineer on the train, then she's fighting the Union Captain Moore, who was doing everything he can just to avoid her. We'll go to the next slide. Here's some pictures here of the track. Frequent stops is a picture. Now, on this train, they certainly had some civilian passenger cars. And that photo on the left is great. You can see the train was stuck. They had to repair tracks, and so now they were just stretching their legs, if you will. Quite a long journey. Go to the next slide. Then they got to Atlanta, and look what they saw. Atlanta was completely in ruins. When General Sherman marched through, he torched the town, and it just everything crumbled. It was a mess. They didn't know exactly where they could even find a place to sleep in the evening and rest. Go to the next slide. This was the Atlanta Iron Works. That's all that's left. If you look closely, you can see all the cannonballs. They still on the ground. You can see a couple of cannons there, just barrels there on the ground. The whole town was absolutely destroyed. We'll go to the next picture. But they did find this one house in Atlanta, and Confederate General John Bell Hood, this was his house he used as his headquarters. Of course, the Civil War is over, he's not there anymore. And I happen to like this picture I found. That's the house. And you can see Union soldiers, got a couple of horses there, and you can see them all kind of taking a break in front of the house. Well, that's where the whole detachment rested until I could figure out their next move. We'll go to the next slide. Now, the next slide is, once again, is our picture, and up at the top, circled in blue, is Atlanta. Now, they had to make it, the train. There's no indication that they had to change boxcars. They probably just uncoupled them and made a switch to the next freight engine. I can't imagine that they would keep on emptying these boxcars. So they went from Atlanta all the way down to Macon. And lo and behold, there was no delays, and they made good time. So now they're finally at the point where they would have gone if the green track on the drawing was open. We'll go to the next slide. So now they're at Macon, and they've got to wait for the for the next train so they could switch boxcars and engines so they could take the railroad from Macon to their destination of Andersonville. So they got stuck here in Macon for another day. Now, the problem was, it was July 23rd, 1865, one of the hottest summers down in Georgia. High humidity, over 100 degrees. And this whole journey, they had no air-conditioned cars or whatever. Some of the cars that the soldiers had to travel in, for additional air, they had to punch holes in the ceiling of the car, which seems to work pretty good. It was an actual terrible trip. We'll go to the next slide. But anyway, they finally made another change, and they took the train from Macon to Andersonville. They finally made that connection. And you can see, yes, it was a roundabout way, But no, the trip was not canceled, and that's strictly due to Clara Barton and Dorrance Atwater. They were determined to do this. We'll go to the next slide. So the train leaves Macon for Andersonville. You can see that now they switched trains. They got the 7,000 headboards. And so now they're heading south. We'll go to the next slide. Finally, they reached their destination, Andersonville Prison. And there's the train track. That's a picture of it today. On the left, the train tracks are still there. So you can imagine the train right there with their 6 boxcars stopped. And the destination, of course, was on the right, was the Andersonville Stockade Prison. So the total trip from Washington, D.C., when they started, to Andersonville took 17 days, from July 8th to July 25th, 1865. That is amazing. 17 days. And we'll go to the next slide. Now, here we go again. I'm sure they had wagons there at Andersonville. A lot of these wagons at Andersonville were used in the prison to transport the dead from the prison that were dying every day, to load them up in wagons, and they would transport them to the area where the cemetery was. So I'm sure they had a lot of wagons down there. And this is kind of a nice picture there. It shows the freight cars up on the tracks. And they had, once again, one by one, all of these 7,000 headboards had to be taken off the 6 railroad cars, loaded onto these wagons, and taken to the prison. We'll go to the next slide. Now, you've got to remember there was over 12,000 Union soldiers had perished in Andersonville. So there's 12,000 plus grave sites. The federal government only furnished them with 7,000 headboards. And from the information I got, they made them locally here, so they sent out to a sawmill in Georgia for another 6,000 headboards. It doesn't say exactly where they made them, but I did some research here, and I found that there's a place called the Ragsdale Sawmill in Homer, Georgia. And there's a picture of it, and you can see the old railroad train there. And you can see the size of the logs, and it's probably around the right size when they machined them down, cut them down to headboard size. So they scrambled and kept on going to make all these additional 6,000, which were sent by train back down to Andersonville. And on the right, that's a picture, almost what it looks like today, of the old sawmill. It was actually a little bit north of Atlanta where this is. Go to the next slide. Now, the 40-person Union detachment really had their work cut out for them. They had to go, all these graves, they were just crudely marked with the actual number of the prisoner on it. Put all these headboards on, which were not lettered, one by one, and they'd had to letter them, soldier's name, whatever, and do that. So there was 12,920 wooden headboards were finally installed August of 1865 in all that heat. What an incredible undertaking. And of course, Dorrance Atwater was, he lost so much weight in Andersonville, and he actually recovered from diphtheria and scurvy, things like that came back when he was in Terryville, Connecticut. He was very persistent. He was probably only 20 at the time, And we owe a lot to certainly Clara Barton, and how by chance that they met in Washington, D.C., and she saw a huge opportunity here. It's an incredible part of history and how they had overcame from Captain Moore. So we'll go to the next slide. And these are what they look like. These are probably only 2 pictures in existence here, which I got. And you can see the wooden headboards, pretty much the size of what the marble ones would have been. And on the right, you can see a separate section with no numbers on. Those happen to be the 6 raiders that we talked about in the previous episode that were hanged in the Andersonville because they were robbing prisoners and killing prisoners just to stay alive. And they were in an entirely different, separate section. So you can give an idea of how they put the prisoners' number sequentially, the unit they were in, and that information. Those all had to be 12,000 hand-lettered. So you can imagine this incredible operation in that Georgia heat back in 1865. So we'll go to the next slide. And finally, when it was all done, they had Clara Barton, finally, Captain Moore, for some reason, had a little bit of generosity in him. He had to raise the flag at the cemetery, and that's a great drawing of the cemetery at Andersonville. You can see the American flag there. She raised it, played the national anthem, and the project was finished. So once again, this concludes episode 5. We've got a lot more. The story has just begun for Dorrance Atwater. We're going to continue that in the next episode. Once again, it's Dave Norton from Discovering New England History. Have a good evening.